The freezing darkness pressed against the perspex like a living thing. Flight Lieutenant Wallace McIntosh sat hunched in the rear turret of Lancaster bomber PB-416, his breath forming crystals of ice on the inside of his oxygen mask. 24,000 feet above Normandy, on the night of June 7, 1944, the cold was so intense that it felt like knives piercing through his electrically heated suit. Behind him, in the mid-upper turret, his Canadian crewmate, Pilot Officer Larry Sutherland, scanned the star-filled sky with the same methodical precision. They had developed an understanding over dozens of missions, a silent language of survival that needed no words. Tonight, they would need every ounce of that hard-won experience. The bomber stream was heading toward Cerisy-la-Forêt, a concentration of German armored forces threatening the newly established Allied beachheads. Just yesterday, thousands of men had stormed the beaches of Normandy. Now, 112 Lancaster bombers were racing through the darkness to ensure those men would survive their second day in occupied France. But Wallace McIntosh wasn't thinking about the strategic importance of the mission. He was thinking about the Junkers 88s and Messerschmitt 210 night fighters that were undoubtedly climbing through the darkness below, their pilots desperate to stop the bomber stream before it could rain high explosives on their comrades. What made McIntosh different from most other air gunners wasn't just his keen eyesight or his steady nerves. It was something far more unusual, something that had taken him months of painful trial and error to understand. He had mastered a technique that seemed to defy all logic, a method that went against every natural instinct a gunner possessed. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand the fundamental problem that plagued bomber gunners throughout the war. When you fire a weapon from a moving platform at another moving target, your bullets don't travel in a straight line relative to the ground. They inherit the forward motion of your aircraft. This creates a phenomenon that confused and frustrated countless gunners, leading to thousands of wasted rounds and missed opportunities. Imagine you're standing on the back of a truck moving at 60 miles per hour. You throw a ball straight up in the air. Where does it land? Right back in your hands, because the ball is moving forward at 60 miles per hour, just like you are. Now imagine that same scenario, but you're trying to hit another truck passing you in the opposite direction. Suddenly, everything becomes vastly more complicated. For bomber gunners, the mathematics of deflection shooting became even more complex. A Lancaster bomber cruised at roughly 200 miles per hour. German night fighters approached at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. The closing velocity could be over 500 miles per hour, and you had perhaps 3 seconds to identify the threat. Rotate your turret, aim, and fire before the enemy was either on top of you or had passed into your blind spot. But here's where it gets truly counterintuitive. In many attack scenarios, particularly when an enemy fighter was overtaking the bomber from behind and slightly to the side, the gunner had to aim behind where his eyes told him the target was going. His instinct screamed at him to lead the target, to aim ahead of it, like a duck hunter leads a flying bird. But those instincts were wrong. This is what made McIntosh exceptional. He understood the geometry of relative motion in a way that most gunners never grasped. When Wallace McIntosh first joined No. 207 Squadron at Royal Air Force Spilsby in Lincolnshire in February of 1944, he was already a veteran. He had completed a tour of operations and earned the Distinguished Flying Medal. But he knew that his survival had been partly luck. He had scored one victory over Neuilly-le-Camp in May, but he also knew he had wasted hundreds of rounds on targets he should have hit. So he did something unusual. Between missions, when other crew members were drinking in the mess or sleeping off their exhaustion, McIntosh would sit with pencil and paper, drawing diagrams. He would sketch the relative positions of bombers and fighters, calculating angles and velocities. He pestered the intelligence officers for every scrap of information about German fighter tactics. He studied gun camera footage from RAF fighters, trying to understand the geometry of successful attacks. What he discovered changed everything. The key lay in understanding that in certain attack profiles, the enemy fighter was actually moving backwards relative to the bomber's frame of reference, even though both aircraft were moving forward relative to the ground. When a fighter attacked from behind and slightly above, trying to position itself for the classic rear quarter attack, it had to slow down relative to the bomber. From the gunner's perspective, the fighter appeared to slide backwards through the sky, even though it was actually moving forward at 250 miles per hour. In this scenario, if you aimed where your instincts told you to aim, leading the target like shooting at a flying duck, you would miss every time. Your bullets would stream harmlessly ahead of the enemy aircraft. Instead, you had to aim behind the fighter, letting it fly into your cone of fire. It was maddening. It was counterintuitive. It went against every natural impulse, but it worked. McIntosh practiced this technique obsessively. He would sit in his turret during the long flights over the North Sea, tracking friendly aircraft with his guns, not firing, but calculating, always calculating. Where would I aim? What's the relative motion? Is the target closing or opening? He developed an almost instinctive feel for the angles. Larry Sutherland, the mid-upper gunner, noticed what McIntosh was doing and joined in the training. The two men would discuss their observations during debriefings, comparing notes, refining their understanding. They developed a system of communication, calling out not just the position of enemy aircraft, but their relative motion. Fighter at 6 o'clock low, sliding back. Fighter at 4 o'clock level, closing fast. Other crews thought they were overthinking it. Just point and shoot, right? Track your tracers onto the target. But McIntosh and Sutherland knew better. By the time you saw your tracers and corrected your aim, the enemy fighter would have already fired its cannons and broken away. You had to be accurate with your first burst. The discipline paid off on May 3rd, when McIntosh brought down a Messerschmitt 110 during a raid on Mély-le-Camp. But it was the mission of June 7th to 8th that would prove just how devastating this technique could be in the hands of a master. The Lancaster bomber lifted off from Royal Air Force Spilsby at 22:45 hours. Wing Commander John Gray, the squadron commander, was at the controls. It was an honor to fly with the commanding officer, but it also added pressure. Gray expected the best from his crew. The crossing of the English Channel was uneventful, the dark water far below reflecting occasional glints of starlight. But as they approached the French coast near Cabourg, McIntosh felt his pulse quicken. This was the danger zone. The Luftwaffe knew the bomber routes and had positioned their night fighters along the likely approach corridors. McIntosh scanned the darkness systematically, using the technique he had practiced hundreds of times. Don't stare at one spot. Keep your eyes moving. Look for the slight darkness against the stars that betrays an aircraft's silhouette. Listen to the engine note for any change that might indicate another aircraft nearby. The first indication of trouble came not from sight, but from sound. Through his headphones, McIntosh heard the intercom crackle. Navigator to pilot, we're on track, approaching target area in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. An eternity when you were sitting in a Perspex bubble at the rear of a bomber, the most vulnerable position in the most vulnerable aircraft in the sky. Then he saw it. A slight disturbance in the stars at 7 o'clock low. His heart hammered, but his voice was steady. Fighter, 7 o'clock low, coming up. Sutherland's voice came immediately. I see him, Wally. I've got him. But McIntosh kept his eyes locked on the approaching aircraft. It was climbing, trying to position itself for an attack from below and behind, the classic night fighter approach. The German pilot was good, keeping his closure rate low, trying to creep up undetected. But he had been detected. McIntosh watched the fighter's relative position carefully. It was sliding backwards in his field of view, exactly as he had calculated it would. The pilot was throttling back, trying to match the Lancaster's speed for a longer firing opportunity. Range was everything. Too far and your bullets would dissipate harmlessly. Too close and you risked the fighter's cannons tearing your aircraft apart. Wait for it. Wait for it. At 300 yards, McIntosh knew he had to act. Fighter identified. Junkers 88. The German fighter was close enough now that he could see the twin-engine nacelles, the distinctive glazed nose. A formidable opponent, armed with multiple 20mm cannons and sometimes even a 30mm cannon, firing upward through the fuselage. Gray's voice was calm. Do what you need to do, guns. This was the moment McIntosh had trained for. Every instinct screamed at him to aim ahead of the fighter, to lead it like a duck hunter leads a flying bird. But he forced those instincts down and aimed where his calculations told him to aim. Behind the target. Aim behind it. His thumbs pressed down on the firing buttons. The 4 Browning 303 machine guns roared to life, the recoil shuddering through the turret mounting. Tracers streamed out into the darkness, and McIntosh walked them onto the target with minute adjustments. The German pilot saw the tracers too late. He broke right, trying to escape the stream of bullets, but McIntosh had anticipated the break. He continued firing, leading the turn now, and his bullet stitched across the fighter's port engine. Flame blossomed, orange and terrible, in the darkness. At the same moment Sutherland opened fire from his mid-upper turret. His angle was different, his bullets converging with McIntosh's from above. The combined weight of fire was devastating. The Junkers 88 staggered in the air, both engines now trailing fire, and began to spiral downward. "Got him!" Sutherland's voice was exultant, but McIntosh was already scanning for the next threat. German fighters often hunted in pairs. Where there's one, there's another. He didn't have to wait long. Fighter, 6 o'clock level, closing fast. This one was more aggressive, boring straight in for a beam attack. The pilot had seen what had happened to his wingman, and was determined to exact revenge before the British gunners could react. But McIntosh was already reacting. This was a different geometry entirely. The fighter was approaching from almost directly behind. Closure rate high. No backwards sliding here. This was a pure deflection shot, requiring him to aim ahead and slightly high to account for bullet drop. His guns were still hot from the previous engagement. He rotated the turret smoothly, no wasted motion, and found the target in his sights. The fighter was close now, probably 500 yards, and closing. In seconds, it would be in cannon range. McIntosh fired. Sutherland fired. Both gunners had perfect sight lines, and their streams of tracer converged on the attacking fighter like twin rivers of fire. The German pilot never had a chance to fire. McIntosh's opening burst struck the cockpit area. Through his sights, he saw pieces flying off the aircraft. It broke away sharply, diving toward the earth with the smoke trailing from its fuselage. 2 down. But the night wasn't over. The Lancaster thundered on toward the target, now just minutes away. Below, McIntosh could see the flash of explosions as the leading elements of the bomber stream began dropping their loads on the German armor concentration. The sky was a maze of searchlights and flak bursts. Pilot to crew starting bombing run. Stay sharp. This was the most dangerous time. The bomber had to fly straight and level, giving the bombardier time to line up on the target indicators dropped by the Pathfinder aircraft. For 90 seconds, the Lancaster would be unable to take evasive action. They would be sitting ducks. McIntosh's eyes ached from the strain of searching the darkness. The temperature in his turret was somewhere around -40 degrees. His fingers were numb despite the electrically heated gloves, but he didn't dare relax his vigilance. And then, there it was. Fighter, 5 o'clock high, diving. This was every bomber crew's nightmare. The diving attack from above and behind, the fighter using gravity to boost its speed, the pilot able to fire for longer because he was matching the bomber's velocity more closely. McIntosh rotated his turret, but the angle was extreme. The fighter was above his maximum elevation, mid-upper to pilot, hard starboard turn. Now. Gray didn't hesitate. The Lancaster rolled violently to the right, bombs still in the bay, the bombing run forgotten. Survival came first. The maneuver saved them. The German fighter's first burst passed just above where the Lancaster had been a moment before. But the aggressive maneuver also gave Sutherland a perfect shot from his mid-upper turret. He opened fire, his bullets raking the fighter from nose to tail. The German aircraft staggered, but didn't fall. The pilot was skilled, rolling away from the fire and coming back for another pass. But he had made a mistake. In his focus on the bomber, he had forgotten about the rear turret gunner. As the fighter rolled level for his second attack, he presented his side profile to McIntosh's guns. It was a brief opportunity, perhaps 2 seconds, but McIntosh didn't waste it. He fired a long burst, aiming not at where the fighter was, but where it would be when his bullets arrived. Hydraulics ruptured. The fighter's control surfaces went slack. The aircraft began to tumble, completely out of control. At 20,000 feet, there was no recovery from that kind of damage. The fighter fell away into the darkness, spinning like a leaf caught in a storm. Sutherland's voice was breathless. Three in one night. Are you seeing this? But McIntosh was trembling now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. His mouth was dry, his hands shaking. 3 kills, 3 enemy aircraft brought down in less than 30 minutes. Pilot to crew, well done. Guns. Now let's finish what we came here to do. Gray pulled the Lancaster back onto its bombing heading. They had drifted several miles off course during the fight, but the navigator quickly calculated a correction. 12 minutes later, the bombardier called bombs away, and the Lancaster lifted as 6,000 pounds of high explosives fell toward the German positions below. The return journey was eerily quiet. The Luftwaffe had lost several fighters that night, and the survivors had retreated to their bases to refuel and rearm. The bomber stream crossed back over the English Channel without further incident. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, McIntosh finally allowed himself to relax slightly. His legs were cramped from hours of sitting in the confined turret. His eyes burned from the strain, but he was alive. They were all alive. The Lancaster touched down at Royal Air Force Spilsby at 0530 hours. As the crew climbed out, ground crew members gathered around, staring at the empty ammunition cans and the gun barrels still warm from firing. Wing Commander Gray pulled McIntosh and Sutherland aside. The station commander will want to talk to you both. 3 confirmed kills in 1 mission. That's exceptional shooting. News of the engagement spread quickly through the base. By breakfast time, other crews were asking McIntosh about his technique. How did you do it? What's the secret? McIntosh tried to explain the concept of aiming behind a target that was sliding backwards relative to the bomber, but he could see the confusion in their eyes. It was one thing to understand it intellectually, and quite another to apply it in combat, when your life depended on getting it right. Over the following weeks, McIntosh and Sutherland would add more victories to their tally. By the end of the war, McIntosh would be credited with 8 enemy aircraft destroyed, making him the most successful air gunner in Bomber Command. 7 of those victories were shared with Sutherland. They would both be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and McIntosh would receive a bar to his earlier Distinguished Flying Medal. But it was that night over Normandy, June 7th to 8th, 1944, that proved the value of mastering the counterintuitive art of deflection shooting. While other gunners fired frantically at enemy fighters and missed, McIntosh and Sutherland calmly calculated angles and relative motion, aiming where logic said they shouldn't, and brought down 3 enemy aircraft in a single mission. The technique they perfected would eventually be studied by training schools. Gun camera footage from successful engagements was analyzed frame by frame. What McIntosh had figured out through observation and calculation would eventually be taught as standard doctrine. But understanding the theory and applying it under combat conditions were 2 different things. It required nerve, discipline, and countless hours of practice. It required a willingness to trust your calculations over your instincts. It required the ability to remain calm when a fighter was boring in on your position, cannons blazing, death approaching at hundreds of miles per hour. Let's talk more about why this technique was so difficult to master and why so many gunners never truly understood it. The human brain is wired to predict motion based on what we observe in everyday life. When you throw a ball to someone, you naturally lead them, throwing to where they will be rather than where they are. When you shoot at a clay pigeon, you swing your shotgun ahead of the target. These instincts are so deeply ingrained that overriding them requires tremendous mental discipline. But in the complex geometry of aerial combat, these instincts could get you terminated. The problem was that the gunner was on a moving platform, and that platform's motion had to be factored into every calculation. It wasn't just about where the enemy fighter was going. It was about where the enemy fighter was going relative to where your bomber was going. Consider a specific scenario. A German fighter approaches from behind and slightly to port, climbing to attack position. From the ground, an observer would see both aircraft moving forward. The fighter is faster, so it's catching up to the bomber. Logic says the gunner should lead the target, aiming ahead of it. But from the gunner's perspective inside the bomber, the situation looks entirely different. Yes, the fighter is catching up in terms of forward motion, but it's also moving upward relative to the bomber's level flight path. And here's the critical part. To set up for the attack, the fighter pilot has to slow down relative to the bomber. He can't just blow past at maximum speed. He needs to match velocities, at least briefly, to get a good firing solution. As the fighter slows down relative to the bomber while climbing into position, it appears to slide backwards in the gunner's field of view. The fighter is at your 7 o'clock position, then 6:30, then 6 o'clock. It's moving backwards relative to your frame of reference, even though it's moving forward relative to the ground. In this scenario, if you aim ahead of the fighter, your bullets will miss in front. The fighter will fly into empty air while your tracers streak harmlessly past its nose. Instead, you need to aim behind the fighter, perhaps even behind where it is right now, because by the time your bullets arrive at that point in space, the fighter will have slid backwards into your cone of fire. It's maddening because every fiber of your being is screaming at you to do the opposite. Your training, your instincts, your experience hunting rabbits or shooting clay pigeons, all of it tells you to lead the target, but if you do, you'll miss. McIntosh understood this at a visceral level. He had trained himself to ignore his instincts and trust his calculations. When he saw a fighter sliding backwards in his sights, he didn't aim ahead. He aimed behind. And he hit his targets with devastating consistency. But there was another factor that made McIntosh exceptional: his patience. Most gunners, when they spotted an enemy fighter, would immediately open fire. The sound of their guns gave them psychological comfort. They were fighting back. They were doing something. But they were also wasting ammunition and alerting the enemy fighter to their awareness. McIntosh would wait. He would track the target silently, his guns trained but not firing, calculating the geometry, waiting for the range to close to where his bullets would be most effective. 300 yards, 250, 200. Only then would he fire, and only then would he fire in controlled bursts, not wild spraying. This patience was especially important given the limited ammunition carried by Lancaster gunners. Each gun had a finite supply of rounds. Once you expended your ammunition, you were defenseless. Many bombers were brought down by fighters that attacked after the gunners had exhausted their ammunition on earlier, less threatening targets. McIntosh husbanded his ammunition carefully. He wouldn't fire warning shots. He wouldn't fire at extreme range. He would wait until he was certain of a hit, and then he would fire with lethal precision. Larry Sutherland, his mid-upper gunner partner, adopted the same philosophy. The two men worked together seamlessly, coordinating their fire, ensuring they didn't waste rounds on the same target. They developed hand signals and code words that allowed them to communicate even when the intercom was jammed or damaged. Their partnership was crucial. The rear turret and mid-upper turret covered different sectors of the sky. The rear gunner could engage targets approaching from behind and below, but had limited upward elevation. The mid-upper gunner could engage targets above and to the sides, but couldn't fire directly backward. By working together, they created an overlapping field of fire that was extremely difficult for enemy fighters to penetrate. On the night of June 7th to 8th, this partnership was on full display. The first two Junkers 88s were engaged with coordinated fire from both positions. McIntosh and Sutherland didn't just shoot at the same targets. They calculated their firing solutions independently and then combined their fire to create a devastating concentration of bullets that no fighter could survive. The third kill, the Messerschmitt 210, was even more impressive. The fighter had approached from an angle that gave neither gunner a perfect shot, but by coordinating their fire and forcing the fighter to maneuver, they created an opportunity. When the German pilot rolled level for his second attack, he briefly exposed his side profile to both gunners simultaneously. The combined weight of fire from 8 .303 machine guns firing simultaneously was absolutely lethal. After the war, when researchers analyzed the effectiveness of bomber defensive armament, they found that coordinated gunner teams like McIntosh and Sutherland were exponentially more effective than individual gunners working alone. Two gunners working in perfect coordination were not twice as effective. They were 5 or 6 times as effective. But coordination required communication, and communication required trust. McIntosh and Sutherland had flown together for months. They knew each other's quirks and capabilities. They could anticipate each other's actions. When McIntosh called out a target, Sutherland knew exactly where to look. When Sutherland reported his ammunition state, McIntosh adjusted his own firing to compensate. This kind of teamwork couldn't be taught in training school. It had to be earned through shared experience, through missions flown together, through the gradual building of mutual trust and understanding. Now let's consider the broader implications of the backwards firing technique. The Luftwaffe Night Fighter Force was one of the most effective elements of the German air defense system. By 1944, they had perfected tactics that allowed them to approach bombers from angles that minimized their exposure to defensive fire. They used the cover of darkness to creep up on bombers, often positioning themselves directly below where the bombers' guns couldn't bear. The development of upward-firing cannons, known as Schrägmusik, had made these attacks even more deadly. A fighter could position itself underneath a bomber, match its speed exactly, and fire upward into the bomber's fuel tanks and bomb bay without the bomber's crew ever knowing they were under attack. Many Lancaster bombers lacked ventral turrets, the ball turrets that hung from the belly of American B-17s and B-24s. This was a weight-saving measure, but it left the bombers vulnerable to attack from below. Between January and May of 1944, losses in Bomber Command reached catastrophic levels. On some raids, more than 5% of the attacking force failed to return. Gunners like McIntosh represented a critical defense against these tactics by developing techniques that allowed them to engage fighters even in difficult geometries. They forced the Luftwaffe to adapt their tactics. German pilots learned to be more cautious, to break off attacks earlier, to spend less time in the engagement envelope where British gunners could bring their weapons to bear. But the backwards firing technique had applications beyond just defensive combat. Some pilots and tacticians began to wonder if the principle could be applied offensively. This thinking led to interesting developments in fighter tactics. British pilots flying aircraft like the Mosquito Night Fighter began experimenting with attack profiles that used similar principles of relative motion. By positioning themselves in specific orientations relative to enemy bombers, They could create firing solutions that were easier to calculate and more likely to result in hits. The gyroscopic gun sights that became common in 1944 were essentially mechanical computers that automated these calculations. A pilot would frame the target in his sight, estimate the range, and the gyroscope would automatically calculate the correct amount of lead based on the rate of turn. But even with these advanced sights, understanding the underlying principles of relative motion and deflection shooting made pilots more effective. McIntosh's technique also influenced post-war training doctrine. After the war, when military analysts studied the effectiveness of aerial gunnery, they found that the vast majority of rounds fired in air combat missed their targets. Hit rates were often below 1%, but gunners like McIntosh, who understood deflection shooting at a deep level, achieved hit rates that were an order of magnitude better. This led to fundamental changes in how gunners were trained. Instead of just teaching them to point and shoot, training programs began to emphasize understanding the geometry of aerial combat. Gunners were taught physics and trigonometry. They were given problems to solve, scenarios to calculate. The best gunner wasn't necessarily the one with the fastest reactions or the steadiest hands. It was the one who understood the mathematics of motion. But there was a darker side to the story as well. The knowledge that a small number of exceptionally skilled gunners could achieve such devastating results put enormous pressure on average gunners. If McIntosh could shoot down 3 fighters in one night, why couldn't everyone else? This led to exaggerated claims and false reporting. In the chaos of night combat, with multiple aircraft firing at the same target, it was often impossible to determine who had actually brought down an enemy fighter. Gunners desperate to prove their worth would claim kills that couldn't be confirmed. Intelligence officers trying to boost morale would accept marginal claims as confirmed victories. The official records show that McIntosh was credited with 8 confirmed kills and several more probables were damaged. But the reality is that confirming aerial victories was notoriously difficult. Many genuine kills went uncredited because no one else saw them happen. Many credited kills were actually the result of combined fire from multiple aircraft. What made McIntosh's record more credible than most was that many of his victories were witnessed by other crew members, and in some cases, by other aircraft in the bomber stream. The 3 kills on the night of June 7th to 8th were all confirmed by multiple witnesses. Wing Commander Gray, flying as pilot, provided detailed reports. The navigator confirmed the timing and positions. Other aircraft in the formation reported seeing the burning fighters fall away. But even with this level of confirmation, historians remain cautious about World War II aerial victory claims. The general consensus is that victory tallies were inflated across all air forces by a factor of 2 to 3. What this means is that McIntosh's 8 confirmed kills might represent anywhere from 3 to 8 actual enemy aircraft destroyed. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that McIntosh and Sutherland survived their tours of operations when the majority of bomber crews didn't. In Bomber Command, the overall loss rate was approximately 44%. Nearly half of all men who flew in bombers didn't survive the war. The life expectancy of a rear gunner was measured in missions, not months. McIntosh flew 55 missions. Each one could have been his last. Each night that he climbed into that frozen turret at the back of a Lancaster could have been the night that a burst of cannon fire tore through the perspex and ended his life. But his skill, his discipline, his mastery of the backwards firing technique kept him alive. After the war, McIntosh returned to Scotland. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to reconcile the person he had been during the war with the person he wanted to be in peacetime. He had ended the lives of enemy aircrew, young men, probably not much different from himself, who had families and hopes and dreams. The fact that it had been necessary, that it had been in defense of his own life and the lives of his crewmates, didn't make it easy to live with. He worked various jobs, never quite settling, never quite finding the peace he sought. The cold of that turret never really left him. For the rest of his life, he would feel cold more easily than other people. His hands would shake sometimes, and he would remember the vibration of 4 machine guns firing in the darkness. But he also took pride in what he had accomplished. He had been good at something that mattered. In the most important conflict of the 20th century, he had developed a skill that saved lives and contributed to victory. The technique he had mastered through observation and calculation had been adopted by training schools and taught to thousands of other gunners. Larry Sutherland returned to Canada after the war. He and McIntosh stayed in contact for a while, exchanging letters, but gradually lost touch as the years passed, and their lives took different paths. Sutherland rarely spoke about the war either. When pressed, he would say only that he had been fortunate to fly with excellent crewmates, and that survival had been mostly a matter of luck. But it wasn't just luck. It was skill. It was discipline. It was the willingness to ignore instinct and trust calculation. It was the patience to wait for the right shot rather than firing frantically at every shadow in the darkness. The story of Wallace McIntosh and Larry Sutherland represents something important about aerial combat in World War II. Success didn't come from bravery alone, though bravery was certainly required. It didn't come from aggression alone, though aggressiveness had its place. Success came from understanding the fundamental principles of physics and geometry, from mastering the mathematics of motion, from developing techniques that seemed to defy logic, but were actually rooted in deep understanding. The backwards firing technique that McIntosh mastered was counterintuitive, because it required the gunner to aim at where the target had been rather than where it was going. But this only seemed counterintuitive because the gunner's frame of reference was itself moving. Once you understood that the target was moving backwards relative to your frame of reference, the technique made perfect sense. This principle has applications far beyond World War II aerial combat. In any situation where you're trying to hit a moving target from a moving platform, understanding relative motion is crucial. Modern fighter pilots learn these same principles, though now they have computers to do the calculations automatically. Naval gunners engaging surface targets must account for the motion of both their ship and the target. Even athletes throwing or kicking a ball must intuitively understand how to lead a moving target. But in 1944, there were no computers in the back of a Lancaster bomber. There was just a young man in an electrically heated suit, sitting in a Perspex bubble at 24,000 feet, with nothing between him and eternity but his skill and his understanding of the laws of physics. On the night of June 7th to 8th, 1944, that understanding was enough. 3 German fighters fell from the sky above Normandy, their crews lost to the darkness. In the grand scheme of the war, 3 fighters was a tiny number. But to the crew of Lancaster PB-416, those 3 fighters represented the difference between life and ending. To the soldiers fighting on the beaches below, the successful bombing raid those 3 fighters had tried to prevent represented the difference between holding the beachhead and being pushed back into the sea. Wars are won by the accumulation of small victories. A fighter shot down here, a bombing raid completed there, an enemy formation disrupted, a target destroyed. Each individual action seems insignificant when measured against the scale of the conflict, but together these small victories add up to something larger. McIntosh's mastery of the backwards firing technique contributed to one of those small victories, and in doing so, he demonstrated something important about skill and understanding. The best warriors aren't necessarily the bravest or the strongest. They're the ones who understand their craft at the deepest level, who can see the patterns that others miss, who can remain calm when others panic. In the freezing darkness above Normandy, with enemy fighters converging from multiple directions, McIntosh didn't panic. He calculated. He aimed. He fired, and 3 enemy aircraft fell from the sky. That night changed something in the squadron. Other gunners began to pay attention to what McIntosh was teaching. They began to understand that there was more to aerial gunnery than just pointing and shooting. They began to study the geometry, to practice the calculations, to develop the mental discipline required to override their instincts. The results were measurable. In the months following June 1944, loss rates in No. 207 Squadron were lower than the Bomber Command average. More enemy fighters were claimed destroyed or damaged. More crews came home. Was it all because of McIntosh's technique? No. Many factors contributed to survival rates. The introduction of better radar warning systems helped. The gradual attrition of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots reduced the threat. The Allied invasion of France forced German fighters to operate from bases farther from the bomber routes. But the backwards firing technique was part of the equation. It was one tool in the arsenal of skills that kept bomber crews alive. The final months of the war saw McIntosh and Sutherland continuing to fly missions, continuing to perfect their technique, continuing to protect their crew. They flew raids deep into Germany, attacking oil refineries and marshalling yards and industrial centers. They faced flak and fighters and the constant threat of mechanical failure, but they kept flying, and they kept coming back. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, McIntosh had completed his second tour of operations. He had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and bar, the Distinguished Flying Medal, and the unofficial title of the most successful air gunner in Bomber Command. But what meant more to him than any medal was the fact that every member of Wing Commander Gray's crew had survived the war. Not one had been lost. In an Air Force where the loss rate approached 50%, where entire crews could disappear in a single night, where death was so common that it became almost routine, this was an extraordinary achievement. And it was due in no small part to the skill of the 2 gunners who had mastered the art of aiming where logic said they shouldn't. The story of the backwards firing technique is ultimately a story about the power of understanding. In combat, knowledge is survival. Understanding the principles that govern your environment, mastering the techniques that make you effective, developing the discipline to apply those techniques under pressure. These are the things that separate those who survive from those who don't. McIntosh didn't invent deflection shooting. The principles had been understood since World War I, but he took those principles and refined them to an extraordinary degree. He practiced until the calculations became instinctive. He trained until he could apply the technique without conscious thought. And when the moment came, when enemy fighters were converging on his aircraft in the darkness above Normandy, he was ready. 3 fighters in one night. 8 confirmed victories total. 55 missions completed. An entire crew brought home safely. These are the statistics. But behind the statistics is a story of dedication, of intellectual curiosity, of the willingness to question assumptions and master difficult techniques. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just for what it tells us about World War II aerial combat, but for what it tells us about excellence in any field. The most successful people aren't always the most talented. They're the ones who are willing to do the work, to study the fundamentals, to practice until difficult techniques become second nature. They're the ones who can remain calm under pressure and apply their knowledge when it matters most. On a cold night in June of 1944, high above the battlefields of Normandy, Wallace McIntosh demonstrated what mastery looks like. While other gunners fired frantically and missed, he calmly calculated angles and aimed where his training told him to aim, behind the target, into the space where the target was sliding backward through his frame of reference. And 3 enemy aircraft fell from the sky, their pilots never understanding why the British gunners' bullets had found them when so many other gunners had missed. The secret was understanding. The secret was discipline. The secret was the willingness to trust in technique over instinct. That was the secret of the backwards firing technique, and that was why it changed everything.